Although we are sharing this year's events virtually, the festival is based in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and we respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been lost forever and can never be recovered. We also acknowledge the island of Uktahumguk, Newfoundland, as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, and we acknowledge Labrador as the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Innu of Ntsinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, and the Inuit of Nunatuhavut. We recognize all First Peoples who are here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As First Peoples have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the culture, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all.
Elmaya, I'll just begin by welcoming you and welcoming you back to the St. John's International Women's Film Festival. I want to thank you for making the film. It's a beautiful film. And I want to thank you for taking this time to chat with us today. It's really an honor, actually, to meet you. I've seen your other work, not all of it, but some of it. And I've seen, obviously, this film, Mmapiiyipitssini, The Meaning of Empathy. It's an intimate portrayal of a community coming together to find a solution to substance use in the midst of an opioid crisis. Can we begin with your thoughts on what was happening in your community when you started the film in 2015? And what I'm wondering, that was there a defining moment for you when you just knew you had to tell this story?
Sure. Thank you so much for everything you said. And it's an honor to be screening at the festival again. I wish I was there in person. So the film came out of, I guess, my own sense of responsibility as a community member to document the hard work that was happening within the community. I was witnessing so much important community mobilization, so many people putting in countless volunteer hours to fight for solutions, to fight to save lives. And I was also witnessing this really complicated conversation about harm reduction. And my mother, Dr. Esther Tailfeathers, who you see in the film, we're very close, and she tells me about her day, and I would hear about everything that she was witnessing and experiencing. And I wanted outsiders, especially in Southern Alberta, to understand that there was so much work happening in the community, because I wasn't necessarily seeing it in the news media. Often the stories that I was seeing were kind of framed through this lens of tragedy and trauma. And I felt like what outsiders, people who are not from the community, I wanted them to understand that there is so much hard work happening, and we have so few resources, so many barriers, and yet our people are finding the capacity to move forward and try and find solutions.
Yeah, I mean, it's so clear that, there's so much great work that is happening in your community. And, combining that with the intimacy of the stories and the people that we really get to know in the film. It's also historical, it's political. It carries you as a filmmaker. It carries so much responsibility to your community, to the people in the film, and even to your own mother, right? And how did you, I'm just curious to hear you talk about how you personally navigated that, and how in the making of the film, how you could give yourself some empathy, really, right?
Well, I just felt so incredibly honored to be able to be documenting this work. I'm so immensely proud of where I come from and my community. And the research process started with community. It started with listening to voices from within the community. I have never lived with substance use disorder, and I don't work on the front lines. I'm just a filmmaker. And so I was starting from this very kind of novice understanding of harm reduction and also substance use disorder. I'd seen it in my family, and we'd lost family to the opioid crisis. So I had that understanding, but I didn't have necessarily the intellectual or lived experience understanding of substance use disorder, and also what it means to work within harm reduction services and to provide services on the front lines. And so my work was very much rooted in understanding those experiences through community voices. And so before even going to camera, I think I spoke with at least 50 people over a year of development and research, and just learning from them and witnessing them do their work and being constantly humbled by the work that was happening. And so I wanted to be able to translate that into the film to provide both our own community and also other Indigenous communities, as well as settler audiences, to be able to understand that there's this wide breadth of community knowledge and experience, and that the voices of people who actually have the lived experience of substance use disorder need to be centered in the conversation, because so often they're left out of the conversation, and they're framed as kind of like the subjects of the film without any sort of agency. And I thought that was really important, because that is so much about that is so much in line with harm reduction, and this idea of having empathy for people who live with substance use disorder, but also the very important mechanism of making sure that they are centered in the conversation in terms of how we find solutions.
Okay, so I'd really like to talk a little bit more about that, because, you know, you do learn so much about how the community has come together and what the community is doing. But the film really leaves you, for me anyway, getting to know people in a way where, you know, you get to know them as people, as complicated, complex individuals, not just a label of someone with substance use, I'm sorry. Elmai, what I want you to talk about is, during the making of the film, like, what were some of the decisions that you made to, like, even around what you chose to film, what you chose not to film, to ensure that the people who were choosing to spend time with you and give you their stories, to ensure that they did have agency in the telling of that story?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's this major responsibility of being a community member and working with people from my community and working with my own family. And so it's an immense responsibility to have to, not to have to, but to tell that story with you know, care and dignity, and working from a place of ethics that's rooted in community care. And this value, this Blackfoot value of Mmapiiyipitssini, of having empathy for others, is something that informs all of the community work that's happening on the front lines. But I also wanted to implement that into my process as a filmmaker, and to think about harm reduction as well as a process, as a filmmaker. And so there was this like constant self-interrogation and navigation of like figuring out how to not replicate extractive forms of documentary filmmaking, because I am an outsider in some ways, in terms of not having substance use disorder and not working on the front lines, and knowing that I in no way can represent those lived experiences solely on, you know, my own lived experience. And so I kind of went into this massive deep dive into looking at films and television shows about addiction or substance use disorder. And you see kind of the same sort of tropes and characterizations of viewing people with addiction in a way that doesn't offer agency and can often be very dehumanizing and can often feed into the stigma and shame around drug and alcohol use. And so I wanted to really push against that, because all of these people that you see in the film are human beings, and they have families who love them, and they have hopes and dreams, and there are reasons for why they use drugs and alcohol. And I think in particularly a place like Southern Alberta, which is just like so openly hostile towards Indigenous people, like racism is very present. I felt a strong sort of sense of responsibility to make sure that I was documenting people with substance use disorder in the most careful, respectful way, and making sure that they were also part of the process. And so all of the people that you see in the film saw a fine cut. They saw it before we finished. I wanted to make sure that they were happy with the way that they were represented. And it was really important that throughout the process, I made sure that they understood that we could stop filming at any point, that they didn't have to answer questions they weren't comfortable with. And I also felt the need to document them in spaces that they were comfortable, and spaces that showed them as the human beings that they are. So, it was such a privilege to be able to film with Lori in her household, and to meet her family and get to see her as the loving, caring mother that she is, and the community member that she is. And the same with George and Leah. That was a very complicated story to navigate, and they became like family to me. I see them all the time when I'm home. They actually bought a trailer not too long ago, so they're living in a somewhat of a home. It's a home to them now, and so they call me, and that's really nice. But it is this like very careful navigation of understanding that it's this massive ethical responsibility to take care of the people whose stories I'm telling, because it's an immense privilege to be able to tell those stories. And there's also this question that I consistently ask myself, which is, will this negatively impact them in 5 or 10 years from now? So thinking about every sort of decision in that way. And I certainly made mistakes along the way, and a lot of choices were made in the edit suite. The pandemic actually gave us the luxury of having more time to edit. And so there were a lot of ethical considerations that were made also in the edit.
Well, I have to tell you that, you clearly made some good choices, because you really remember Lori. And, I was going to ask how that she was doing, and especially the kids were doing, and the other couple that you've just told us about. You hold them, and they stay with you. So, do you think that I'm curious to ask you about your process in the edit suite, actually, and how you approach your editing? But before we do that, how, I think I know the answer to this, but I just like to hear you talk a little bit more about, as documentary filmmakers, the responsibility to engage and share the process with the people who are sharing themselves with you. I mean, not everybody does that, but is it a practice that you think is important for all documentary filmmaking? Curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable not sharing that. I've done it in my past works always, because it feels like if I don't do that, I'm simply extracting someone else's story, someone else's experience, and then interpreting it through my own lens in a way that maybe doesn't necessarily do that person's story justice. And I think um, often when it comes to Indigenous stories on screen, our people are not given the agency or the power to have any sort of say over how we're represented. And so I think my process is just sort of reflective of what a lot of Indigenous filmmakers are doing, and that is centering stories in community and centering process in community as well. I don't, I know it sounds strange to say, but I don't necessarily even think of myself as being a documentary filmmaker. I feel like what I was doing was just telling a story that had to be told and doing it in a way that reflected community practice and community protocol. And yeah, and I think also something else that was really important throughout our process was very early on. I wanted to be able to hire as many Indigenous crew as possible, but there aren't enough Indigenous technicians working in the key departments. And so I ended up working with also non-Indigenous crew members, and I felt a responsibility to make sure that they understood the gravity of the story we were telling, and sort of the respect and care that we needed in order to tell these difficult stories. And so early on, we did a kind of like, I think it was 2 days, it might have even been 3 days of cultural competency training. We had ceremony, we had elders speak with them about Blackfoot practices, Blackfoot ways of understanding the world and community, and so it felt like it kind of grounded us in a process of respect and care very early on. And I think that it's important that we work together in terms of the film industry, where we're always going to be working across cross-cultural barriers and understandings of the world through specific cultural lenses. And so I felt like in welcoming these people into my community, they needed to understand that it's an immense privilege to be able to witness the stories that we were witnessing, and that we needed to have a great deal of care in terms of telling those stories.
And now, Maya, in that context, were there some training programs as well as part of the crew?
Yeah. So we made sure that on every single shoot there were well, Indigenous crew just in general, but also that there were trainee positions. Some of our trainees ended up just also being camera operators, so you see it in the credits. There's a lot of Indigenous people who operated the camera, and we had local crew members. I think it's really important that when we go into community, that we're also supporting that community economically and offering some sort of reciprocity. And I think that can translate into hiring local people. I mean, there were numerous PAs throughout the process who had never worked in film before, and it was just a wonderful experience to know that they, as community members, could offer something that just a standard, film PA from outside of the community could not. And so there was a lot of that sort of thinking of like, how do we make sure that this is very much rooted in community, and it's not, replicating extractive forms of filmmaking.
Can you talk a little bit about your editing process, like how you like to work with your editor? Like, are you a filmmaker who spends a lot of time in the edit suite? Do you go in for months on end, or do you take breaks? It's always interesting to hear from different filmmakers about how they approach the crafting of the story in the edit suite.
Well, I think one thing that I really think is necessary is to know the footage inside and out. So I before going to the edit suite, and throughout, so we worked on the film for 5 years. We filmed for close to 4, and it was in total 5-year process. But I watched all of the footage and basically transcribed it myself with time code. And then I went into the edit with Hans Olsen, who worked with Tasha Hubbard on Mmapiiyipitssini, We Will Stand Up, and also Birth of a Family. And he's this immensely sensitive editor who's very meticulous and also works from a place of feeling and emotion and care and empathy. And so it was a wonderful experience working with him. But we worked together very closely for quite a long time. And he came to New York because I was staying in New York. I went to Edmonton, then he came to Vancouver when the pandemic hit. And so it was a complicated edit process because of the pandemic. But generally, what I love is just to sit next to the editor and work together and experiment. We had, I think the first assembly was like close to 5 hours. And so it was just like constant sort of massaging and recognizing that, there was so much footage that just wasn't going to make it to the screen, and having to just understand that, in no way could I fully encapsulate the community's experience and story. And so it is what it is.
I'm sure you screened it for the community first, probably, right?
Yeah, because of the pandemic, we were unable to do like a community gathering, so we had to do online online screenings. And so I still haven't had the experience of being able to watch it with my community. But yeah, during the process as well, we made sure to show it to everybody who's in the film, but also to show it to people who weren't involved or who aren't involved in film, but have an understanding of, say, harm reduction or substance use disorder, and also just Indigenous people who might be able to address any sort of blind spots that we'd forgotten about, or yeah.
Your mother, I was reading, or maybe it was during Hot Docs, but at one point your mother spoke about this film as a mirror to your community and a window to Canada. Can you speak a little bit about this? I mean, I'm taking something that your mother said, but I'm curious just to hear you talk a little bit about that, and to ask you, like, is there a call to action for audiences that see this film, no matter where they are?
Sure, yeah. My mother has a really poetic way of speaking. She's a brilliant woman, but I think in terms of it being a mirror to the community, there was this kind of, I had, I guess, the luxury of, because I was a filmmaker, I was able to spend time with so many people from different walks of life within the community. And Kainai is a massive community. There's a lot of people we don't necessarily know. Not everybody knows each other, but we have this connection of being from that place. And so I had the privilege of being able to spend time with so many different kinds of people and learn from this wide breadth of community knowledge and experience. And I wanted to be able to offer that same experience to people from within the community. And I think that could serve as a catalyst for dialogue, because harm reduction is still a divisive issue within the community. And then in terms of it being a window, I think it's an opportunity for non-Indigenous audiences to really understand the struggles and the barriers that exist within the community. Many of them are rooted in, government policy, lack of access to resources, and systemic inequality that exists in every facet of our lived experience as Indigenous peoples. But also, I hope that it serves as a catalyst for action, and maybe a deeper understanding of harm reduction, and the fact that it is a necessary tool in this spectrum of work that needs to happen when it comes to substance use disorder. In terms of action that I think audiences can take, I think they can support local harm reduction agencies and initiatives. I think that they can hopefully share the film with others. In Alberta in particular, the United Conservative Party has cut a lot of funding to harm reduction services. As you see in the film, they closed the supervised consumption site in Lethbridge. And since then, we've had the highest numbers of death due to overdose or drug poisoning in ever. And so I really hope that people understand the necessity of harm reduction and also recognize the fact that these are human beings and these deaths are preventable, and that these people had families who cared about them and loved them, and they belong in our communities. But also that harm reduction saves money, if that makes sense. Like it's proven that it saves government dollars when it comes to policing, when it comes to ambulance and emergency visits, hospital visits. It makes sense in so many ways, just even on a logistical level. So I just hope audiences kind of walk away with that understanding, and also maybe a deeper understanding of why so many of our people live with substance use disorder, and that it isn't just an issue of historical trauma, but also ongoing trauma because of systemic inequality and ongoing colonial policies.
So, from your perspective, if harm reduction is an empathetic approach to dealing with substance use for all the reasons that are outlined, clearly in your film, why is there such resistance? I mean, why is it so challenging for people to kind of embrace? I'm not talking specifically only about your community, but you could. I'm talking in general. Like, why are we living in a world where it's so challenging for people to embrace empathy, to deal with anything?
I think it has to do with just the shame and the stigma that's associated with drug and alcohol use. And if you look at the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's very much rooted in principles of the church, and abstinence is kind of accepted as the golden standard of treating addiction. But the numbers show that abstinence models actually generally don't work for the majority of people who are living with substance use disorder, and that relapse is a natural part of the recovery process. And so there's this really unrealistic, inhumane expectation that's placed on people, I think because of this sort of like ideology that's been drilled into our heads for decades. When you watch any sort of film or television show where a character lives with addiction or substance use disorder, there's like the classic scene of them going to AA meetings. And so it's kind of like this like idea that that's the only way forward, where with harm reduction practices, there's this whole wide spectrum of approaches that are sometimes radical, sometimes a little bit experimental or strange, in regards to like comparing it to abstinence models. But what we know is that we need to change the way that we approach addiction, and I don't think harm reduction is the only solution. I do think that it's just one step along the way. Like with my community, we've received some long-term funding for the detox and the recovery center, the Bringing the Spirit Home detox. So now there's also like an aftercare wing, so people who go to the detox can then go to treatment, and after treatment they can come live back at the detox in the aftercare center. And so I think that's a really beautiful model to think about, also like housing as harm reduction, because it's proven that when people have the safety and stability of housing, that it's going to inherently reduce their use of substances. And so, we just have to think about different approaches, because the approach that we've had for so long isn't working.
And I mean, I think it also just acknowledges that, people are different. People need different things to find their own solutions.
Absolutely.
Maya, I'm going to, because we're running out of time soon, and I also pulled a quote from an article that I found that's published at Sundance a few years ago. And this is your quote. It's not your mother's, it's your quote. And it's that you say filmmaking as a craft is rather elitist. You generally have to come from some form of privilege to even become a filmmaker. My question, I absolutely agree with that, but my question is, do you think this is changing at all? This was a few years ago, I pulled that article was written. And what can we all do in the industry to acknowledge and question that privilege that defines access to story in this country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is changing to a degree. We're seeing, the emergence of the Indigenous Screen Office, which comes from decades of advocacy and activism from Indigenous people within the film community to fight for change. We're seeing, funding initiatives. We're seeing at the NFB in particular, there's been this movement to try and have a better relationship with Indigenous filmmakers and storytellers and communities. And so I think we still have a long ways to go, but I certainly think it's changing. I think a lot of work is happening on the part of Indigenous filmmakers themselves. Like, we're changing the way that films are being made. We're pushing for more representation behind the camera in all of our, the key technical departments, because that certainly influences what we see in front of the camera. And there's just so much. I think that especially last summer, in 2020, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think there was kind of this this catalyst for the industry as well to recognize that there are massive gaps, and when it comes to representation, and when it comes to access to story, and I think that translated as well into the Indigenous experience and Indigenous storytelling in Canada. And so I think there's a long way to go. I think that it needs to come in the form of policy changes. So like, there actually have to be policies in place to ensure that there is adequate access to story and resources to tell these types of stories, and that we need to just give marginalized voices our fair share to the resources, because there isn't a lack of talent, there's just a lack of opportunity.
Okay, well, maybe we should end by asking you to share a little bit with us about, your own commitment to telling the stories that you want to tell, the stories that are important to you, and perhaps tell us a little bit about maybe what we might look forward to in a couple of years. Have you back at the festival? What you're thinking about for your own storytelling?
Well, I guess I just try and tell stories that have some sort of meaningful impact on my communities, and also stories that I feel maybe I needed when I was younger that I didn't have. And I'm so inspired by the Indigenous film community. There's so much that's happening right now that's really exciting to witness. I'm in Dennis Goulet's Night Raiders, which is this incredible dystopian thriller, and they had the biggest budget that any Indigenous film has ever had in Canada, and so that is a pretty substantial moment for Indigenous film. And then we're seeing, the success of Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls in the US, and so there's some really exciting stuff happening, and it's really inspiring and just makes me so proud to be a part of that community. And it's because of, years of activism and advocacy. And then in terms of what I'm working on right now, I'm acting in a TV show out in Montreal for Amazon called Three Pines. And I'm developing my next narrative feature-length film. I'm still in the writing phase of it, but it's kind of speculative fiction, queer love story, sci-fi-ish, thriller set in my home territory in Kainai. So yeah, I'm kind of moving into something very different, but also excited about it. And yeah, a couple other little things on the side as well.
Well, that sounds like a perfect film to have you back here in a few years. Amaya, what about, for any young Indigenous aspiring filmmakers who are thinking about, or young people who are thinking about, I want to get into this industry. I want to tell stories. What advice do you have?
I think,
I don't know if that's a fair question, but
yeah, I think something I've learned and continue to rely on is community is so valuable to process. So there's so many people who have lifted me up and supported me in my career. Dennis Goulet and Lisa Jackson and Tasha Hubbard and many more. The sense of community and belonging has been so important in my process and in my career. And I think watching the way that those people in particular work has really inspired me to challenge the ways that we work in the industry and to create new ways of working, to build a process that's more reflective of community and of ethical practices that exist within Indigenous communities. And so I think when it comes to young Indigenous storytellers or just people from marginalized communities, I think that, if we implement community, it can only serve to enrich the process, and also that there isn't one single way to make a film, that we have to just follow our instincts and we have to follow the ethical practices that we know and respect in our process.
yeah, I remember something else I read when you were talking about, I forget where I read it, but you said, the bar for you always ask yourself, would your grandfather be proud of this film or be, like that? It's like having that. So it's your present community, but it's not just like, it's a community that is part of you in many ways, right?
Yeah. I just seek to make films that make my grandparents proud.
Yeah, well, I can relate to that for sure. Okay, well, I think, unless there's anything else, Amaya, that you want to share with us or leave with us, I think this has been really great and helpful and insightful and hopefully inspiring for lots of people.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it was a wonderful conversation. Thanks for all the thoughtful questions.
Thank you.